For our independent trip, Corvo, Isaac, and I went to the War and Women's Human Rights Museum in Songsan, Seoul. The War and Women's Human Rights Museum strives to educate visitors on the history of Korean female sex slaves during World War II. Friday afternoon, we got on bus 7737 at Itaebugo and made our way towards the museum. After about a 20-minute bus ride, we arrived at the bottom of a hill. After walking up the hill, we came across a wall of paper butterflies with writing on them. The butterflies represent victims of Japanese military sex slavery and all women, and each butterfly has written on it a message to all the women that suffered during the Japanese reign. After entering, we received our audio guides. Unfortunately, we were told that we were not allowed to take pictures of any of the exhibits. However, we did our best to describe them, as well as our experiences viewing them, with voice memos on Isaac's phone. The first exhibit was a memorial with butterflies and bricks. The butterflies represent the women that suffered as sex slaves, while the bricks represent discrimination and violence. The piece of art shows the butterflies projected, breaking free from the violence, which mirrors the women's journey towards recognition. The next exhibit was through a hallway outside of the building. Upon opening the door to go outside, loud sounds of cannon fire and soldiers marching began to play. As a result, we felt as though we ourselves were on the battlefield. Walking down the hallway, there were exhibits on both sides. On the left side, there are paintings of girls who are walking with their heads bowed and don't know where they are going. On the right side, there's a mural sculpture with faces of the victims that have already grown old, modeled after Emory. Walking down the stairs, we saw paintings that were painted by the victims, representing their memories of being taken by the Japanese soldiers. After this, we entered a dark basement room. The dark basement represented women's struggle. Following this, we then walked up the stairs to the Wall of Appeals. Beautiful quotes from the Emory written on them. It's like a wild dream that I survived. It's too wild a nightmare to be called a dream. How bitter a life I shall live, bring my youth back. I want to hope for women suffering from the same pain as mine. I am the very evidence alive. Why does Japan say they have no evidence? My wish is that I may hear even a word of sincere apology. Once we got up to the top of the stairs, we came across the main historical portion of the museum. Before this point, the museum, while informational, had mostly tried to mimic the struggle of the comfort women. Now, on the second floor of the building, there were many exhibits featuring both evidence from the comfort women days, as well as expressing stories from specific women. These women were brave enough to speak up. Otherwise, the whole situation with female sex slavery during World War II would have been buried. According to one of the exhibits, they would scream voicelessly in captivity. Someone might ask, how did the comfort women get captured and turned into sex slaves? Unfortunately, they were often tricked into thinking they would get good jobs. Their ages ranged from 14 to 19, with the youngest being 11. These women and children were raped in caves and dugouts. The excessive rape and sex led to sexually transmitted diseases becoming a big problem. This resulted in all the comfort women also being seen by a doctor to examine for STDs or STIs. The scariest part of the comfort stations was that there were long lines of soldiers waiting for their turn. These lines indicated that these women were raped many, many times in a short period. Eventually, in 1988, the situation was revealed. Shockingly, however, the Japanese government denied it. After the Japanese government denied any allegations about the comfort stations, more survivors started testifying. Then, finally, the Japanese government partially admitted to their existence, but instead of taking accountability for allowing them to happen and supporting their construction, they shifted blame to the private recruiters of comfort women. This was a vain attempt to minimize the scale of the comfort stations and the government's involvement. The museum's existence is the perfect reminder that no matter how badly a government tries to cover its past, the truth cannot be silenced forever. So, what's your name?
My name is Hana-san.
You volunteer at this museum. Since you started working at the museum and since you started working on the book project, what are some things that you learned from your work here that you didn't know about the Japanese military sexual slavery before?
I
Okay, so in Korea, although this issue is really widely known, I've received an American education, so I had been taught nothing about Korean history essentially, and all I knew about Korean history was what I learned from living here rather than in school or through any formal education. So I feel as if after I started working in this museum, I just had so many different outlets to learn about Korean history, especially because the people who work here and establish this museum are so well educated on the subject, especially on like politics. So I feel as if although I knew about this issue and how it was a really like hot topic in Korea, I never knew about like the individual stories of each grandma and like especially about like what happened to them after they got released from sexual slavery and how difficult it is for them to lead on with their lives after they've had their childhood and teenage years taken away from them. When they were originally trying to build this museum, the city of Seoul, they allowed for them to have a piece of land in which they could build their museum. And in Korea, you have to advertise a museum for 3 years before it's allowed to be built.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they poured, the people at the museum, they received like funds and they poured their own hard work and money into advertising the museum. But after they were trying to do their first like ceremonial like shovel and for the construction of the museum, people from the older generation, so like maybe like 70 up, people who were actually part of like the Korean War experience, many of them actually protested it very severely, saying that they don't want this quote-unquote shameful part of history to be shown and displayed, I guess. In Korea, like the topic of sex itself is a very sensitive issue, and this sexual slavery, even if it was by force, they still consider it to be shameful, and they don't want that kind of history to be associated with their country. So it's a very like sensitive topic,
Yeah, I understand.
especially when it comes to like whether they were compensated properly or not. So because some people think that they were compensated properly in like the 1970s or something, but like other people, they completely against that. That's why we still have a protest every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy.
Thank you so much for
No problem.
speaking with us and for giving us the audio guides to the museum.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.